to be together sharing this conversation. As I mentioned, my name is Anna LePay, and again, really thrilled you can all be with us. As a writer, advocate, and funder, I've been working with colleagues around the world for 2 decades trying to sound the alarm about the need for food systems transformation, particularly a shift away from agrochemicals, including pesticides. As we get started in this conversation today, I just want to give a quick special shout out to Tiffany from Real Food Media, who's running the tech on the back end. Thanks, Tiffany. We so appreciate all the work you're doing behind the scenes. Today, we're here to celebrate the launch of the US version of the Pesticide Atlas, a compendium of the state of pesticides on the planet today, produced by the German-based Heinrich Böll Foundation. As we launch the US edition of the Pesticide Atlas, and we'll be sharing a link to the download of the PDF shortly, we're bringing together some of the contributors to the US-focused chapters for a conversation about the connections between pesticide use and public health, the climate crisis and biodiversity, and we'll also dive into the policy barriers to better regulation in the United States, the role industry disinformation plays in stalling such regulation, and we'll hear a case study showcasing opportunities for action on pesticides here in the US. As many of you know, more than 60 years ago, Rachel Carson published her groundbreaking book, Silent Spring, Awakening the World to the Dangers of Pesticides. Carson's book was a sort of who's who of pesticides, helping alert the world to their hazards for people and ecosystems. Her guiding impetus, she wrote, "If we are going to live so intimately with these chemicals, eating and drinking them, taking them into the very marrow of our bones, we had better know something about their nature and their power." More than 60 years later, we are using more pesticides than ever, many of the very ones that Carson was so concerned about, and many, many more than just those. And I'm thrilled that you've joined us to dig into this conversation with some of the leading researchers, scientists, journalists, and advocates who are very much helping us know something about their nature and their power, and very much helping carry on the legacy of Rachel Carson. For our webinar flow today, we will start with a few words from each of our panelists sharing some of the themes of the chapters that they contributed to the US edition of the Pesticide Atlas. And then we will open up to a panel conversation and open up to questions from all of you. So you've probably been to a Zoom webinar before and you're familiar with what you will see in the bottom of your screen, which is a Q&A function. In that Q&A function, you can click there and you can put questions to us at any point during the conversation, and then I'll be sure to circle back to them when we come to that point in the conversation toward the end of the hour. As we get into conversation today, as I mentioned, we're going to be joined by 4 incredible leaders. Each of them and their organizations contributed to the Atlas. And today we're joined by Emily Marquez, a senior scientist at Pesticide Action Network of North America, Lori Ann Bird, Environmental Health Program Director of the Center for Biological Diversity, Stacy Malkin, co-founder and managing editor of US Right to Know, and Annie Frederick, the Executive Director of Hawai'i Alliance for Progressive Action. As I said, I'll bring each of them into the conversation to offer some reflections for a few minutes and then pull back up and into a panel conversation, including, again, any questions you have. Please do feel free to ask us in the Q&A section. So we're going to turn to Emily Marquez first. Emily is with Pesticide Action Network of North America. PAN North America is one of 5 regional centers worldwide, linking local and international consumer, labor, health, environmental, and agricultural groups as a united international citizens action network. For the Atlas, PAN contributed a chapter on the state of pesticides in the US and the links between pesticides and the climate crisis. And so, Emily, it is really a thrill to have you here. I so appreciate the work that PAN does, the work that you do, your incredible leadership in the field. Emily has some slides that she'll share, and I'll turn it over to you, Emily. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I'm here, if you were expecting Margaret Reeves, Margaret is on a plane due to travel delays and couldn't be here today. So I'm presenting in her stead, but she's the person who wrote wrote these two chapters. Okay, sorry. There. So the first chapter that Marg worked on for the Atlas is on pesticide use in the US. This is obviously an important issue for us in Pan North America, and the top uses of pesticides in the US are on commodity crops, so crops grown primarily, for sale, and they bring in big money for farmers. So these are corn, soy, and cotton. With genetically engineered crops, many of these have herbicide tolerance as a trait, and glyphosate is the top herbicide used for this herbicide tolerant trait. And as a result, glyphosate is a big top herbicide used in the US. In California, pesticide use is quite high, as California is a major agricultural powerhouse. And also in California, we grow a lot of specialty crops. So those are things like nuts and fruit. These kinds of specialty crops, earn higher dollars for growers. And as a result, there's also a greater motivation for growers to invest in their crop by using pesticides. And in addition, specialty crops can be pesticide intensive. So strawberries are a good example. For farm workers, these are the people who pick our food, who help bring it to the stores, in addition to farmers, and they're far more likely to be poisoned by pesticides. They can be exposed through their work, and that includes work doing pesticide applications. Many states have a reporting requirement for doctors, and that includes California. There's various challenges for farm workers getting to the point where they see a doctor after a pesticide poisoning, and doctors don't always know about the requirements to report if those exist in their state, and that likely contributes to underreporting of pesticide poisonings. Also, in the US, pesticide registrations are done based on risk assessment, and this approach uses assessing exposures and then mitigating the risks of those exposures instead of a hazard-based approach, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the health impacts of pesticide exposure, usually these get split into acute or chronic. So the WHO, World Health Organization's definition on acute pesticide poisonings is an illness or health effect resulting from exposure to a pesticide within 48 hours. The acute effects of pesticide exposure are often described as flu-like symptoms, and this can make it difficult for people to recognize them as something that merits going to a doctor, for example. And for chronic effects of pesticide exposure, these include increased risk of reproductive and developmental effects, learning disabilities, and cancers. So now I'm just going to talk about the EU, the European Union's system, which is a hazard-based regulatory system briefly. So using a hazard-based approach has limitations, of course, but it also has advantages that are probably greater than using the risk assessment approach. So this basically results in a more health protective policy when it comes to pesticides that pose a hazard to the population or to the environment. So as an example, the EU has a flat regulatory level for pesticides in drinking water, and I believe in surface water as well. So in the case of the herbicide atrazine, the EU found that this pesticide was exceeding those limits that they already set as a default, and these levels that are found in drinking water could not be managed. So the EU banned atrazine in the early 2000s. The next chapter that was covered by Margaret is this about climate crisis and pesticides. So in the life cycle of a pesticide, from production to application, petroleum products get used, energy. So you may have heard that producing fertilizers consumes a lot of energy. Well, pesticide manufacturing consumes even more. Once they're applied, a pesticide can also emit greenhouse gases or form them. And for some fumigant pesticides, greenhouse gas emissions are very high. And here in this slide, chlorpicrin, which is a top fumigant in California used on strawberries and other crops, is a key example. And there's also sulfurofluoride, which you might recognize because it's often used in, well, it's used in ag, but also in fumigating houses in residential areas. So these graphics were used in the PAN webinar and report on pesticides and climate change. Their report talked about the connections between pesticides and climate change. So with climate change, there comes a host of issues that can further drive up pesticide use. Pest ranges increase with temperature. That means that the area that a pest might be found in is greater after with higher temperatures. And in a changing climate, stress plants are more susceptible to pests. In addition, natural controls may decrease as climate change disrupts the synchronicity of pests. So that's the timing that pests show up in the environment, and their natural enemies. Also, pesticides can degrade faster at higher temperatures, and that can decrease their efficacy. So all of these factors would drive up pesticide use and greenhouse gas emissions. And this is why PAN calls it a vicious cycle. But now I'm going to talk about good news because there are solutions that exist. So on the right, the green part, the vivacious cycle. The application of agroecological practices reduces pesticide use through building soil health, increasing above and below ground biodiversity, increasing crop resilience, and reducing pest pressures. That leads to reduced pesticide use and reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So agroecology, this is what PAN presents as the set of solutions to many injustices and challenges in farming, but also it can affect and solve for agricultural associated contributions to climate change. Agroecological practices do not rely on pesticides as a foundation. Instead, farming without pesticide reliance relies on healthy soils, and healthy soils have to contain a lot of organic matter in order to increase biodiversity. And as a result, this also sequesters carbon in the soil and leads to other good things. For example, more organic matter in the soil holds more moisture. That increases resilience of the system against floods and against drought. Soil with more organic matter is less likely to wash away, to erode, and because there's organic matter, it holds more moisture, more water, and this is good for drought. So finally, I'm almost done. Agroecological principles also include increasing biodiversity, and that supports natural enemies. Diversifying production of crops means growers aren't relying on the price or outcome of one crop that they're growing, and that also leads to economic resilience and healthy diets. Finally, agroecological principles include a social justice framework, and that supports community resilience. So I'll end here, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. You definitely get extra points for stepping in last minute. Really appreciate you so much. Emily mentioned a couple of things I just wanted to pull up, particularly around the links between agrochemicals and the climate crisis. And Emily mentioned a Pesticide Action Network webinar that was done on those linkages. And I just wanted to share, as part of this webinar, we'll be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered. And I will be sure that we include a link to that webinar. It's a really powerful webinar based on some really great work that PAN has done. So thank you for that, Emily. So I want to turn next to Lori Ann Bird from the Center for Biological Diversity. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the center, it was founded in 1989 and has been a leader in systematically and ambitiously using biological data, legal expertise, and the citizen petition provision of the Endangered Species Act to obtain legally binding protections for animals, plants, and their habitat. Lori Ann and her colleague Nathan Donnelly contributed 2 chapters to the US edition of the Pesticide Atlas, specifically on pesticides and biodiversity collapse, and another one on the challenges to regulating and restricting pesticides in the US. So a very warm welcome to you, Lori Ann. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you so much for having me on here. It's a real pleasure to speak with you all today. So I'm going to talk with you about the contents of our 2 chapters in the Atlas. While most of the world is moving away from intensifying their pesticide use and recognizing that they need to reduce the use of pesticides, and especially the most dangerous one, the US is actually moving in the opposite direction. For example, in 2021, the EPA tried to remove restrictions on the pesticide aldicarb on oranges. Aldicarb is so dangerous that 125 countries have banned it. And it's one of only 36 pesticides that are deemed extremely hazardous by the World Health Organization. Don't worry, we sued, we stopped it, it's taken care of, but it gives you a taste of what we're up against with the EPA's pesticide office. In 2019, 1 of every 4 pounds of pesticides used in the United States contained an active ingredient that's been banned in the European Union. So while we often hear about how modern US agriculture is and how advanced EPA's regulatory mechanisms are, that's just really not the case. From 2017 to 2018, 100 pesticide products containing some of the world's most dangerous pesticides were approved by the EPA, including 69 that contains ingredients that the EPA acknowledged were known or likely carcinogens. And even some of those have been previously targeted for phase out here in this country, but continue to get approved and reapproved. So why is the US doing this? Unfortunately, the pesticide industry holds an outsized influence on the regulatory process with our pesticides. The pesticide industry funds and conducts the majority of studies on a pesticide's toxicity that EPA uses in its analysis of that pesticide and in determining whether it should be approved or reapproved. And unsurprisingly, the industry often finds that their products are not very dangerous and certainly much safer than independent studies often find. The pesticide industry also wields enormous lobbying influence in Congress, and that often results in a lot of pressure on the agency to make industry-friendly decisions. For example, just last week, the administrator of the US EPA, Administrator Regan, was hauled in front of the House Agriculture Committee and grilled on their pesticide actions, making it seem like EPA has just been on a spree of banning vital pesticides that we need to feed ourselves in this country, when we all know this is just not the case at all. And he had to defend himself as though they've taken some really radical course when obviously things are not going in that direction. Industry's influence is also seen in the revolving door between the EPA's pesticide office and industry. Of the 7 former pesticide office directors that went on to continue working after they left EPA, all of them went to work for industry in some capacity. There's also a lot of exploitation of the pesticide process, of the approval process, and industry knows all the loopholes inside and out. So for example, there's this idea of an emergency exemption in our pesticide law that allows, if there's a real emergency, a pesticide that's not approved for that use to be used in an emergency circumstance. But there are pesticides that have been used for 10 years in a row on the same crop for the same emergency. So obviously there's no emergency, but industry knows and EPA know that this pesticide or this use could not be approved through the regular process, as lax as it is, because what they're trying to do is simply too dangerous, either to human health or the environment. Fundamentally, the law that regulates pesticides in the US, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, just leaves a ton of discretion in the hands of the agency, and the agency uses that discretion consistently to side with industry. The standard in the statute is that a pesticide has to be approved unless the EPA finds that it has an unreasonable adverse effect on human health or the environment. So what's unreasonable if you are in the pocket of industry? Is driving the extinction crisis unreasonable, or widespread farm worker poisonings unreasonable? In EPA's mind, no, basically nothing is unreasonable. So, you know, that's a real problem. Other statutes like the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act have much more like science-based standards that are easier to work with. Also, the way the statute is set up, we only have 60 days to go to court after a new pesticide active ingredient is approved, and all we have is industry science and EPA's decisions and whatever they choose to release to the public in that process. So it's hard to know when we need to go to court. I'm proud to say that when we make the call and go, we almost always win, but it's a real slog figuring out, do we even need to go? Is this, you know, that dangerous or not? And then it's a real slog to litigate these cases. So on to the next chapter, the extinction crisis. I'm really cheerful today, aren't I? Sorry. Today we find ourselves in the 6th grade extinction that's ever happened on Earth. And this is the first one that's been caused solely by the actions of one species, us humans. So it should come as no surprise that pesticides, as chemicals designed to kill living things, are playing an outside role in driving the extinction crisis. But the US has an incredible law called the Endangered Species Act. And for decades, the EPA has just chosen to completely ignore it in the context of pesticides. No other agency has been so bold. So we and our partners have sued many times, and the EPA has lost many times. I think we won like 5 cases in 3 months this winter. And at this point, the EPA has been so severely chastised by so many courts that it is committed to changing course and following the Endangered Species Act. Over 1,600 plants and animals are listed under the Act in the US, and it's responsible for saving over 99% of the plants and animals under its care. And the way it works is that anytime a federal agency participates in an action that might affect an endangered species, the agency taking that action has to consult with the expert wildlife agencies, either the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service if it's a terrestrial species, or the National Marine Fisheries Service if it's in the ocean. And in this way, they have to look at how to minimize harms and how to ensure that the action might not lead to the extinction of the species. In this way, the ESA has been incredibly effective. But now we have over 1 billion pounds of pesticides used each year in the US, and new species impacted by pesticides continue to be added to the endangered species list every single year, including just last month, the California spotted owl, which is imperiled by rodenticides. And a lot more species are still waiting to be protected under the Act. Species like monarch butterflies that should get a finding in 2024, the American bumblebee, the Southern Plains bumblebee. These are species we've recently petitioned for in recent years. So now that EPA has been forced by the courts to start doing these initial assessments of individual pesticides' impacts on species, it is finding horrible impacts. So one of the first ones it did was glyphosate in 2020. That was one of the early ones by court order. And they found that 93% of all endangered plants and animals are harmed by glyphosate. Glyphosate use, of course, exploded in the mid-90s with the approval and widespread adoption of genetically engineered crops designed to withstand what would otherwise be a deadly dose of glyphosate. And glyphosate is incredibly effective at killing plants. One of the plants that's really good at killing is milkweed. Milkweed is the only host plant for monarch butterflies. Since it's used so widely, a lot of the nation's milkweed has been decimated. That's why anytime you go to an Earth Day fair or whatever, you get milkweed seeds. It was once a weed. So in this way, glyphosate has driven the decline of monarchs. Atrazine is another very widely used herbicide in the US, the second most widely used herbicide here, banned in many other nations. It was found to harm over 1,000 protected species. or 56% of all endangered species in the US, including whooping cranes, San Joaquin kit fox, California red-legged frog, so many species. But one interesting thing that I want to point out that happens in the process of endangered species consultation, and the reason that it matters, is that as these assessments are being made, changes to the action are made. So in the process of doing the Endangered Species Act assessment on atrazine, the EPA and registrants, the makers of atrazine, got together and decided to cancel all uses or ban atrazine functionally in Hawaii, on roadsides, and in forests. So this is just a great example of how the Endangered Species Act actually causes real on-the-ground benefits for endangered species and also all living beings, including us. We're just getting started. Hundreds of more assessments are coming. And I'll just wrap up by saying that while there are many threats to biodiversity, especially climate chaos, that require complex solutions, reducing the threat of pesticides is kind of a much simpler issue to tackle. It just requires the EPA mustering up the political will to stand up to big agriculture and do its job by imposing common sense limitations designed to protect biodiversity. They can do this, but we need to keep pushing to make sure they will, and we hope you'll join us in the fight. Thanks.
Thank you, Lori Ann. Really, really so appreciate the work you do, and hearing your remarks reflecting again on just the incredible, amazing challenges that we face in trying to pass just even the most common sense basic pesticide regulation. And I think you really spelled out so well. And I think your organization has done such a great job of really showing how that Endangered Species Act can be this really critical tool in a context in which regulating in other ways is so hard in this country. So thank you for all your work. Thank you also, people are putting great questions into the chat. I know that we won't have time to get to all of them, but I also know that we will all see your questions. It's always really helpful for us to hear the kinds of questions that you all are raising. So please keep putting them into the Q&A section on your webinar screen. So next we'll be hearing from Stacy Malkin, co-founder of US Right to Know. Her organization is a nonprofit investigative public health research and journalism group working globally to expose corporate wrongdoing and government failures that threaten our health, environment, and food system, a theme to the remarks we've already heard today. Stacy and I have been working together on a series of reports with other colleagues, trying to help expose the industry influence on science and communications, particularly around pesticides, and how that industry influence has been really shaping a lot of the barriers to real stronger regulatory action. I'm very deeply appreciative of Stacy's expertise, your analysis, Stacy, the work you do. She and I contributed a chapter to this US edition of the Atlas that shared some conclusions from a recent study that we had done together on Monsanto and Bayer and the company's decades-long tactics to shape the science around their best-selling herbicide, glyphosate. And you heard in Lori Ann's remarks some comments about glyphosate as well. Before turning it over to Stacy, want to also just give a shout out to our other partner in that report, Kendra Klein from Friends of the Earth, and her work has been really influential in our understanding around the impacts of pesticides. So I want to turn it over to you, Stacy. Again, welcome. So glad you could be here.
Thank you so much, Anna. Hi, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here today to celebrate the launch of the Pesticide Atlas. And I'll be speaking today about the desperate tactics that pesticide companies use to try to control how the public thinks about pesticides and ultimately try to keep them unregulated, which, as we've just heard, they've been quite successful at, and especially here in the US. I use the word desperate deliberately to describe pesticide industry's disinformation operations, because even for those who've worked for a long time in this space, the details are pretty surprising about the scope of the tactics they use, and even the level of detail to which the companies are worried about everything that all of us, that public health advocates, journalists, and scientists are doing to uncover the harms of pesticides. And these are not unlike, very similar to, many of the same tactics, some of the same people that the fossil fuel industry and tobacco companies have used for decades to mislead the public. And as we write in our report that Anna mentioned, the pesticide industry isn't just following in the playbook of those other industries. In many ways, they helped write the playbook since their attacks on Rachel Carson, which were quite severe 60 years ago, all sorts of personal insults, and they still deploy these sorts of tactics, as many of us have experienced personally. I'm going to talk a few minutes about the kind of research we did, how we know all this, how we know so many secrets about what the pesticide industry is up to, and that's coming from their own documents. So the report that Anna mentioned, that Kendra and Anna and I worked on, is called Merchants of Poison: How Monsanto Sold the World on a Toxic Pesticide. And it's a case study, a really deep dive into what the documents tell us about how they ran their product defense campaigns for glyphosate. And we focused on glyphosate for a few minutes. As we heard previously from speakers, it's a very toxic, very highly used, the most widely used herbicide in the world. It's a probable human carcinogen, according to the World Health Organization's Cancer Research Panel, as well as many other harms associated with it. It's a very important profit line for the pesticide companies and for their genetically engineered seeds. So they really had to go all out to protect it when IARC, the World Health Organization panel, said that it was a probable human carcinogen. So we've tracked all this very closely. And for really since 2015, my group has been looking at it. What happened after the IARC ruling was that many farmers, groundskeepers, landscapers started to sue Monsanto, and over 100,000 people have since sued the company, which is now owned by Bayer, alleging that exposure to glyphosate-based Roundup caused them to develop non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And so because of the trials, hundreds of thousands of pages of documents have come out from how Monsanto runs its operations. And we also have many documents from my group, US Right to Know's investigation. We started in 2015 filing public records requests. We filed hundreds of them, trying to investigate how Monsanto and other pesticide companies and PR firms work behind the scenes with academics, universities, government regulators. And we really tried to, have put a lot of effort into trying to understand their nature and their power, as Rachel Carson asked us all to do. So we know a lot about how they run their dirty tricks. And that's what we attempted to describe in our report, Merchants of Poison. And we got a lot of the stories in there, but not even all of them. But it's really quite an eye-opening read. Again, getting back to the desperation, the intensity, the full court press. I want to talk today about three major themes that emerge from that research that I think is important for all of us to keep in mind who are trying in many various ways to confront the impact of the pesticide industry and shift to safer alternatives that are very well documented in the science. So before I get there, I want to say this: while we focused on glyphosate, this is not just a story about one company or one pesticide. If we think about chlorpyrifos, paraquat, the PFAS, BPA, Teflon, asbestos-laced talc, these are just some of the other very concerning chemicals that many of us are exposed to, where you'll find similar patterns. The documents from the companies themselves exposing that they knew, they covered up, they kept selling, they protect their profits doing whatever they have to do. So the three major themes that emerged in our research: first of all, the pesticide companies corrupt the science from the ground up. So it's very well documented that for over 40 years, Monsanto cooked the books on the science on glyphosate. Basically, they, from the types of studies that were conducted, how the studies were done, who writes the papers, what the public gets to know about that. There are many examples of ghostwriting, for example, where Monsanto scientists framed the science, edited the studies, sometimes gave over whole chapters, and were never, that this was never disclosed to the public. So that's a huge problem. Ghostwriting from companies writing science that they don't take credit for in public, because they know that the public and regulators are not as willing to trust them as independent scientists. So they're hiding behind a lot of industry-friendly scientists who in many cases are not independent, in some cases directly getting money from the companies. They practice what I like to think about as PR science. So creating a PR narrative and then making a study to support that, not to look at what the science is actually saying. So an example from the documents, you'll see the Monsanto scientists talking about vulnerabilities in the science on glyphosate, by which they mean problems are showing up and we want to distract from these problems. So an example is genotoxicity, which is the ability of a harmful substance to damage the genetic information in cells. There's a very strong evidence that glyphosate damages the genetic information in cells. And the Monsanto scientists were looking at this problem, and they decided to commission a study from an independent scientist who wrote a paper about genotoxicity. And he came back and said there are real concerns. There are many studies that Monsanto should do to truly understand this problem. And he submits the report to the Monsanto scientists. And so we see from their emails them talking about how this is a problem, how they are not going to do the studies that the scientists suggested, and they need to go and find a friendlier scientist to rewrite the report according to their specification and needs. Their need being that we need to create a public message that this is not a problem. And so that's what they went ahead and did. So lots of examples like this, and we write about them in the report, about what the documents show about how they specifically tried to manipulate science. And it's also important to note that the science that industry is using is flawed and outdated. And there was a recent study from the University of Vienna. They looked at the 53 studies that were submitted to regulators in the European Union on glyphosate for approval, and only 2 of them were acceptable under current internationally recognized scientific standards, and none of them used the most reliable methods for detecting cancer risk. So these are companies that don't want to know what their products are doing to people. So that's the first theme that emerges, the
Stacey,
extent of the—
sorry to jump in. I could listen to you talk about this stuff all day, as you will know, but I want to make sure we get to Annie and get to questions. So we should move on in a second. Yep.
Okay, so 2 more themes that I want to talk about just very briefly. They're deploying an army of third-party helpers. So lots of front groups, professional organizations, trade groups, academics, universities. We name names, and we've got lots of information on usrtk.org of fact sheets talking about these front groups. I think it's really important to know and track these groups. And thirdly, I just want to say, the personal attacks on scientists is a major theme that we see in the papers, and also attacks on journalists. And I think these things are important to note whenever we're talking to regulators or policymakers, to understand that these are companies that are on a full-on attack against science, and we have the evidence to prove it. So we talk a lot also about what we can do about this, and I hope we get to some of that in the Q&A, but I'll leave it here, and you can find Merchants of Poison and all these documents and details at usrtk.org.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacey. And again, thank you to all the work at US Right to Know. It's really powerful work. So I am going to introduce our final presenter today. I'm really delighted that we have Annie Frederick, Executive Director of Hawai'i Alliance for Progressive Action, or HAPA, here with us today. Annie and HAPA's work is really incredible and really helps to kind of touch down in a place how this broken regulatory system is impacting communities, and what communities can do to organize collectively for common sense pesticide regulation. HAPA's work is really incredible organization that works for social, economic, and environmental justice in Hawaii. With my funder hat on at the Ponte Rea Foundation, we've been really thrilled to be able to support the work at HAPA for many years. And I'm really excited that Annie was able to share some of her experience at HAPA organizing in the Hawaiian Islands for pesticide regulation in the US edition of the Pesticide Atlas, and really thrilled that she's here with us today to share more. Turn it over to you, Annie.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to my wonderful co-panelists for your important work, and to all of you joining us here today. For those of you who are not familiar, Hawaii is often dubbed Ground Zero, and the island of Kauai, where I live in particular, as a key hub of the research and development of the agrochemical industry. Up until very recently, Hawaii hosted the highest concentration of experimental field trials in the United States, and just recently has been surpassed by Puerto Rico as some of the movement work has been successful here in the Hawaiian Islands. In Hawaii in particular, a lot of what the industry is doing is developing herbicide-resistant seeds that then get grown at scale in places like the Midwest and around the world. And I'll just mention that Hawaii is one of many sacrifice zones all around the world impacted by the industry. Communities which live adjacent to these agrochemical test fields. And in Hawaii, we have pretty much all of the major agrochemical giants. We have Bayer Monsanto, Dow DuPont, which is now Corteva, up until recently BASF, which then operated through a subcontractor Bex, Syngenta, which was bought through ChemChina, but operates also under a subcontractor Hartung. So residents living adjacent to these fields are routinely exposed to a cocktail of untested combinations of pesticides. We have some of the highest combinations of restricted use pesticides, some of the most frequent application rates of pesticides, and some of the highest pounds per acre application rates of restricted use pesticides, all in Hawaii. And just to mention also that these fields typically are situated adjacent to working class communities of color. Native Hawaiians are disproportionately impacted. And despite the dominant industry narratives that you've heard a little bit about already, contributing jobs and contributing to the economy, the industry is actually highly subsidized. They enjoy some of the access to some of Hawaii's public agricultural land. They're actually the largest tenant of our public agricultural lands and the waters that flow to them. It's important to mention that these are former Hawaiian crown lands, or crown lands that were illegally seized by the US, and have fiduciary obligations to benefit Native Hawaiians. And despite all of these environmental injustices that are facilitated by the state of Hawaii, in resistance to the impacts to communities, a movement has bubbled up in the Hawaiian Islands and really has began to gain critical mass starting in 2012 and 2013. The communities that are heavily impacted pushed back, marched by the thousands in unprecedented marches in the streets, and began to fight for basic public health and environmental protections, and have continued to fight to this day. So, for example, in 2013, 2014, 3 counties passed regulations to protect public health, to require disclosure of what was being sprayed, only to be sued by the industry and to have those important measures overturned under the guise of state preemption, essentially that only the state has a jurisdiction to regulate pesticides and GMOs. I'd like to just mention that the resistance to the industry in Hawaii has employed, it's a broad ecosystem, and HAPA is one of many organizations, volunteers, individual activists that are pushing back on the industry, and really has employed a range of strategies and tactics to push back. Marching in the streets, lobbying at our county and state levels are just some of the strategies employed. And in 2018, we were finally successful in passing the first meaningful regulation in our state, which was the first statewide ban of the insecticide chlorpyrifos, which we hope had opened the door to some of the other states that then enacted similar bans. We finally, after over a decade of advocating for mandatory disclosure or the right to know what restricted use pesticides are being used in our communities, won that right, and now we're finally being able to analyze that data and learn from it, and also strengthen our advocacy. But one important tactic that has been really, I think, one of the most impactful things in our work has been really intentionally building people and political power to push back on the industry. You heard about all the tactics they use from our former panelists, and those are all employed in Hawaii really viciously. One of the impacts we often don't talk about is the impact on the communities and relationships within the communities themselves. When you have an industry that operates in small rural communities and is a major job provider, there's often a real attempt to kind of divide and conquer and pit family members against each other. So that's often like this undiscussed toll that the industry takes. But what has been really successful is folks who have been fed up with this, banging their head against the wall at the counties, at the state legislature, is actually stepping up to run for elected office. And so in 2016, after just frustration with banging our head against the wall, HAPA founded a program called Kuleana Academy, which is a political leadership development program. We started our first cohort in 2016 and since have hosted 6 cohorts and have 98 alumni of the program. And to date, 12 are serving in elected office. And while we do not work on those electoral campaigns ourselves, we provide the training and the skills training to help people to be successful in their efforts to either run or to level up their advocacy and organizing skills, and also to build a network of solidarity. And what we see now is some of the folks who have finally been elected to office are some of the greatest champions for transforming our food system. So we continue to kind of see it as like a marathon and not a sprint, and that we can continue to, and we must continue to advocate for better policies, but without this sort of looking at some of the root causes of the issues and some of the structural causes of the issues, and really supporting leadership that is truly accountable to our communities and not corporate profits. I think that's one of the only ways we're going to really successfully continue to push back. And equally, I think supporting the community organizing work that is necessary for those folks when they do get elected to office or get appointed to boards and commissions, is that there continues to be a groundswell of grassroots community advocating for something different. I think one of the most harmful narratives of the industry is that this kind of food system is inevitable, that this is the only practical way to feed the world. And I think what we're seeing, especially in Indigenous food sovereignty work in Hawaii, is that it is absolutely not inevitable, that there are incredible efforts to restore Native Hawaiian food systems and in a way that has been in harmony with the local ecology for thousands of years, and that if they enjoyed the same subsidies that this industry does, that they would be even more successful. So we're beginning to see that when we build the political power we need, we can start to shift resources towards those kinds of efforts, and we really can create the food system that we all know is possible.
Thank you, Annie. Really appreciate all the work you do, and appreciate ending on the spirit of the kinds of ways that we can see change happen when we organize in community. So thank you for that. I know we just have a few minutes left in our webinar. I'm going to bring everybody up on the screen in a second, and just want to thank you all for all your questions in the chat. A few things I want to share that when we send a follow-up email to everybody, we will include some resources that panelists have mentioned that have been dropped into the chat. We'll include links to reports and certainly share all the panelists' websites and resources like the Kuleana Academy resource. I also want to just again thank the incredible outpouring of interest for this panel. The fact that more than 400 people registered to us was a real sign people are really interested in these issues. And we will also share out the link to the Pesticide Atlas. It's at bit.ly/Pesticide Atlas US. Again, bit.ly/Pesticide Atlas US. And now everybody will join us for the last few minutes together. It's nice to see you all on the screen together. And as I said, so many great questions have come in. We have how many minutes? Not many. So I wanted to just lift up a few questions at once so that you could hear some of these questions, and then you can kind of jump in as you'd like to answer any of them. And again, considering the time, we won't have substantive time to answer them, but just any top level thoughts. So there was a theme around a number of questions about that political power question, questions on do we have allies in Congress right now and who they might be, questions around how can different potential allies be engaged? One person asked about how CPG and natural brands can help. Another question around what about foundations? One person put into the chat a question about, how much the Gates Foundation, for instance, has really been pushing agrochemical reliance in its agricultural development, and how might we respond to that? And let's see, one more question I'll put out to all of you to think about is we have really focused in a lot of the conversation here on agricultural pesticides. And someone asked a question about, well, what about pesticides on public lands and on campuses? And I know that each of you could speak to how this conversation carries over there. So those are just some themes I wanted to shout out of questions that had come in. And we can kind of take it from there. Each of you can jump in and I'll monitor the time, again, keeping your answers short. And like I said, to everybody tuning in, you'll get a very substantive follow-up from all of us, including maybe some more answers to some of your questions. So who wants to start? And again, don't feel like you have to answer all the questions, but if you wanted to jump in to answer any one of them.
I can take a crack. And yeah, so just briefly, I think it's really important to understand, expose the strategies, and challenge corporate influence wherever we can. That's one piece. It's a small piece. That's the piece we're trying to provide by giving groups the tools to understand front groups, strategies, and how the money flow works. And we've also done a lot of reporting and tracking of the Gates Foundation and the very substantive, science-based, very many critiques of how the foundation is trying to expand corporate agriculture in Africa. And so check that out on our website, and how the work of many African groups that have been calling that out for many years.
Thanks, Stacy. And we will put this in the follow-up. I highly recommend an animated series called Rich Appetites that's really helped to tell a lot of that story about what's happening in terms of impacting agricultural development in Africa. So who wants to jump in next on any of the questions? Lori, and I saw you nodding when I asked the question about who do we have any allies in Congress, who they might be. I don't know if you wanted to jump in there.
We do. So there are two pieces of legislation that are exciting. One of them has been reintroduced, and one of them will hopefully soon be reintroduced. The first is the Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act, or PACTPA. And that is a piece of legislation that would comprehensively reform FIFRA, the cost benefit statute that I was talking about, and put in some more hard boundaries, and also ban some of the worst pesticides immediately. And then the Saving America's Pollinators Act is really targets insecticides, specifically neonicotinoid insecticides, which are playing a major role in driving pollinator declines throughout the country. So Senator Booker has been a great ally on the Senate side. Senator Neguse has been a great ally on the House side. Senator Blumenauer, and we have a number of great champions in Congress. Obviously, our Congress is highly dysfunctional, and we are in for a big fight with the Farm Bill this year, no doubt. We'll see how it pans out. In the last Farm Bill, they tried to exempt pesticides from the Endangered Species Act altogether because they saw what was coming. And so, we'll see what types of existential battles face us, but we do have champions, and you can guess who our enemies are as well.
Thanks, Lorianne. Annie, not to put you on the spot, but I wonder if I could to have you jump in about this, not to have us separate out agricultural chemicals from how pesticides are used off of farmland, because I know particularly in the work you're doing on the Hawaiian Islands, so much pesticide use also is on landscape tourist land or used in other places, and wondered if you wanted to say anything on that, or, about our school grounds, for instance, and the work that you did with the Department of Education there.
Yeah, I think just wherever we can, there's so many different fronts for attacking the industry's impact. And I want to shout out some of the work, especially on Maui, that's been really successful. Folks from Beyond Pesticides leading a lot of that work there on really getting a lot of the resorts to shift towards organic land management, and to really, again, with a lot of the Kuleana Academy alumni 4 of the 9 council members have gone through that program. The Maui County Council leading the way and enacting the most comprehensive organic land management, public land management ordinance, I think, in the country. So I think it shows you what's possible. Like, all of these things are possible when we have the right leadership. So it's, again, not a matter of if, it's just a matter of like really building the support for that. And I just want to add that, like, one thing that's been really important to kind of building that power is linking arms with other movements that share similar root causes. So while it's absolutely important, I think, to be like focused on this specific industry, I think also you know, the kind of extractive capitalism that often really drives this profit motive is that we see that across labor struggles. We see that across other, you know, all kinds of other struggles. So I think often when we can find common cause with other advocates, that really helps us in building the political power and the people power that we need.
Thanks, Annie. So we're coming up to time. Emily, I wanted to know if you wanted to jump in with any last words. I know I lifted up that question about how CPG natural brands can help. I also see some other questions around your analysis around California pesticide regulation. But if you want to, any last words of brilliance before we head out here for our day. No
That's
pressure.
a hard one. Yeah, but it won't be brilliant. But I think one of the things that really influences it, how pesticides are used in the U.S. is also just economic interest. So where you can, from a personal perspective, supporting not using pesticides in your community is a first step, and also weighing in about when there's, you know, you could let your representatives know, okay, I'm interested in supporting farming without reliance on pesticides, and what measures might you be engaged around. And yeah, the corporate power, I mean, I cannot say enough about how profound theirs is. So I think influencing your representatives is one way, in addition to supporting our organizations when they ask for weighing in on different political things that we're doing. Okay,
yeah,
so not
that's
brilliant.
Great. No, absolutely. Perfect note to end on, Emily. And we'll send out links as a follow-up to all the organizations you heard from today. I strongly encourage you, if you're not already, to join their mailing list. Like, I often get messages from Pesticide Action Network that inspire me to take action and speak up. So definitely connect with all the organizations you heard today. I want to thank everyone. If we were in a room together, Annie, Stacy, Lorianne, Emily, you'd be hearing loud applause. This is Zoom. You don't hear that. It's very weird, but you should feel a deep appreciation coming at you. I'm seeing it in the chat. Really appreciate all of you, all of your work. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. Again, we're really eager to have you all read and share the US edition of the Pesticide Atlas. The links have been dropped into the chat. I'll say it one more time verbally. It's at bit.ly/Pesticide Atlas, or bit.ly/Pesticide Atlas US. If you have any questions about using the Atlas, any questions about what you heard today, please reach out to us at info@realfoodmedia.org. Again, you'll be getting a resource list as a follow-up to this webinar. Again, I just want to commend all of you who've joined us today and spoken so powerfully about the work you do. Thank you for your contributions today into the Atlas, and hope everybody has a wonderful day. Thanks for joining us. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna.